Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Lecture 6. So far in the course, we have learned about working with general neural network structures and general data. And now's the time to talk about more specialized architectures for more specialized kinds of data. And in this session and in the next session, we'll be talking about a special type of neural network called convolutional neural network. So let's see what's the ideas and intuitions behind these types of neural networks. Okay, so far what we have seen in the course was neural networks like this. In this example, we have the image of a cat here, and we assume that the image has only 16 pixels, 4 by 4. And then the way that we treated this problem in the previous lecture is that we flattened the image. So we took the image out of its matrix structure and we converted it into basically a vector. And then we fed that image into a neural network, as you can see on the screen. So this type of neural network is called a fully connected or densely connected neural network. What it means is that every node in this neural network is connected to every other node in the same network. And when I say connected, I mean there's a weight associated with each link or connection between those nodes. If you remember that we tried to see if we can build a classification model using the Bitmoji data in the previous lecture, and I don't know if you remember the accuracy on the test set, but it was something around 64%, 65%. Not too good, not too good at all. So this was the architecture that we used. Of course, we could have added more hidden layers, hoping that our neural network starts to learn better. However, it's not how it works. So I have told you about the universal approximation theorem at the end of the previous lecture. And I told you that theoretically, no matter how complex the data you're trying to model is, you can always model it, you can always approximate that function using a neural network with one hidden layer, not even too many hidden layers, with one hidden layer. However, the universal approximation theorem does not tell us how exactly we can achieve a certain structure like that, what kind of data set we need to do that, what kind of optimizer we need to do that. So we know we only have a guarantee that, okay, there should be a way. If we had a theorem saying that, no, you can't model certain type of data with a neural network, then that wasn't good news, because we knew before trying that this wasn't something possible. But at least in this case, we know. All right. So let's see how we can treat this problem better. Okay, so in an image is not a general type of data where we cannot really make any assumptions about the structure of the data. An image is if you take each pixel as an input feature, it's a special kind of data, and each pixel has a special meaning in relation to the other pixels in that image. So, for example, if you try to model some general data sets, for example, predicting prices, housing prices in some certain city, and you have a bunch of input features, it doesn't really matter if your first input feature is the climate of that area, the second one is the whatever other feature that is. It doesn't matter. You can shuffle the order of those features, and intuitively it shouldn't make any differences. However, with an image, if you take this image, for example, and you shuffle the pixels around, then the picture does not mean anything anymore if you look at it, right? So there is a special structure. The first pixel is the first pixel and has a certain meaning in relation to the second pixel or in relation to the pixels in the second row, second column. So it's not a general type of data, and we shouldn't treat it as so. Okay, what it means is that we can help our neural network by incorporating those assumptions about the data into the structure of the model. This is an important idea, incorporating assumptions that we can make about the data into the structure of the neural network. This is basically the core idea behind all of the more sophisticated, specialized neural network models that you see that are leaving people in awe about their performance and their capabilities. You cannot just throw any data that you have at a fully connected neural network and then expect it to work properly. Okay, so let's see how we can do it. Just like I said, each pixel, we can think of each pixel as being connected to the other pixels in an image, meaning that it is when these pixels are viewed together that they mean something. For example, the pixel of the pixels representing the eyes and the ears and the face of that cat, if we see them together, then we understand, okay, this is a face. These are eyes, these are ears. So this kind of gives us an idea to try a structure like this. So instead of letting each feature in the input feed information to all other neurons in the next layer, we kind of make them a little bit more specialized. We say, okay, you group of neurons take these 4 pixels, the other group take the other 4 pixels, and so on and so forth. And we, for example, we don't feed the pixels with the red borders into the neurons here at the bottom because they are responsible for another group of pixels. Okay, this helps kind of a little bit incorporate that structure into that kind of assumption into the structure of the neural network, because right now we're taking those 4 pixels together, those 4 pixels together, those 4 pixels together, and so on. So in the example of a fully connected network, no matter which pixels you're talking about, you're going to feed the information from all of the pixels to all of the neurons. So each neuron has to do a kind of a more complicated task. Okay, so that's one idea. All right, so in the next step, instead of flattening the image, we say that, okay, let's group those neurons together, those neurons that are responsible for each part of the image, and then create a matrix out of them. So instead of having one neuron having one weight, we're going to bundle them together, and we are going to look at them in groups of neurons. So this group of neurons has 4 weights associated with it. The other groups of 4 has 4 weights associated with it. So we can kind of think of, instead of having scalar neurons having one weight, we can think of matrix neurons, right? So instead of the weight multiplied by the input, where the weight is a scalar, the input feature is a scalar, we think of both as being matrices or tensors. Okay, so in this case, we have a group of 4 scalar values, and then the neuron itself and the weights themselves are groups of 4 weights. Okay. Now if we take this idea further, okay. So in this context, because of the background that's been developed about image processing, we call this kind of groups of neurons together, these groups of weights together, we call them filters or kernels. And I'll talk more about that, why we call them that. However, at this point, it's the next step is another assumption that we want to make. So if we take this group of pixels and then make a specialized tensor neuron for it, and then the green set of pixels and make a specialized tensor neuron for that, this structure kind of expects to see certain features of the image in certain places. So in order for this model to work really properly, the neural network kind of expects to see, for example, the right eye on those group of red pixels and the left eye on those group of green pixels. And if the the image is upside down, the eyes appear somewhere else, the ears appear somewhere else, then the network might not work as expected. Okay, so it's kind of saying, okay, we're expecting this image, we're expecting the ears of this cat to always appear in that region of the image. And if we do that, we kind of go back to the same problem. So instead of doing that, we say if a group of neurons are specialized in detecting some certain features in a part of an image, there's no reason to believe that those same neurons cannot detect the same features in other parts of the image. For example, if a group of neurons that we have bundled together to form a tensor neuron, if they kind of are specialized to detect lines or edges, if they do that well, we can use them in all areas of the image, not just in the top right corner or top left corner. We can use the same thing to detect lines or edges in all parts of that image. So there's no reason in having different weights for different parts of that image. Okay, this is kind of the core idea of this type of neural networks. Meaning that we take the same group of weights bundled as a tensor neuron, and we apply them onto basically all regions of the image that we have, not just one part. So the previous approach was that we take this group of neurons, it specializes in this certain part of the image. Take this group of neurons, specialized in this certain part of the image. It doesn't work that well, because if your image, if the object that you're detecting happens to be in another region of the image, then your network fails, right? And we don't want that. We want to be able to detect cats in an image, whether the cat is located on the bottom right corner or the top left corner, right? This idea is called translation invariance, meaning that the model is indifferent to whether the object you're detecting, the feature you're detecting, happens to be in a certain part of the image. It could be anywhere. So it's insensitive to translation of that object across the image. Okay. So, applying this idea would result in something like this. So we take the same filter, the same group of weights that I call a tensor neuron, and then we apply that onto all of the regions of the image that we have, not just one region. And they all share the same weights, so because it's essentially the same neuron. Okay, we had a question here. That's a great question. So the question is, if we have detected some certain features like lines or edges or things like that in the image of a cat, could that also be useful for detecting a car or something like that? The answer is yes, and I'll get to that, how that ties into this kind of idea about convolutional networks. Okay, I'll discuss that later on. It's too early, a little bit too early. Okay, so you can see that we're basically taking the same group of weights bundled in the form of one tensor neuron. We call it the filter, and we apply it onto all of the regions in the image. And that, when you apply that, and then there is some certain operation that you need to do in order to represent the outputs of that layer. And if you remember, for example, in a fully connected neural network, we take the inputs, we take the outputs of the previous layer and we just add them up, right? That's what a neuron in the next layer does. We take the outputs of all of the neurons in the previous layer, and then in the next layer, I just add them all up, okay? I multiply them by a weight, add them up. Here we do kind of the same thing. We take the weight multiplied by the pixel values, and we add them up to come up with a new pixel in the newly generated image. Okay. If you remember, I told you that neural networks take the input features, and in the next layer, they generate some new features out of our input data. And in the next layer after that, they take those new input features and generate a new set of features based on that. And this is why I called neural networks giant feature engineers. Okay, so same thing happens here. It takes this group of pixels, transforms it into something else, takes that group of pixels, transforms it into something else, and so on and so forth for all of the pixels in that image. So what we'll end up with, in the end, is a new image that's created by applying that transformation on that image, right? So we take the input image, apply some filters in the beginning with some random weights, and then we generate a new image out of that. Okay. So the most important idea here is that I use the same filter, the same weights, and pass it over the entire image in order to generate a new image. This, you can take it as being analogous to the case of the fully connected neural network, where we take a set of features and we generate some new set of features. Okay, so next thing is that just like in a fully connected neural network, we're not limited to having one neuron in the hidden layer. Here, we're not limited to having only one transformed image in the next layer. We can have as many as we like, right? So we have one filter at the top, you pass it over the image, generates one new image. Take another filter, pass it over the image, generate one other new image. And take another filter, and you can take as many as you like. Just like in the hidden layer of a neural network, of a simple neural network, you can have as many neurons in the hidden layer as you like. Yes?
Do all of these filters need to be different, like filter 1, 2, 3? Or can they be the same?
I can respond to this question by, again, going back to the simple fully connected neural networks. So in a simple fully connected neural network, in the hidden layer, do all neurons have to be the same, have to have the same weights? No. While we train the model, they acquire different values for the weights according to the problem. Same happens here. Okay. So I kind of thought of an analogy this morning that I think would be nice to share with you. So this is kind of similar if you take the example of a pizza. Okay, we have a pizza. Okay, that's kind of the high-level end result of some kind of operations, right? But let's for a second take the lower-level ingredients. You have salt, you have flour, you have water, you have cheese, you have meat, you have tomatoes. Okay, if I make an analogy with a fully connected neural network, the approach to make a pizza would be to mix all of that stuff together and expect a nice pizza coming out of the other end. That's usually not what happens. We have to go step by step, process each set of ingredients together to make some nicer, higher level ingredients, and then make a pizza out of it, right? For example, we first have to make a tomato paste and add some salt to it, add some pepper to it. And then we have to make the flour into a dough and add water to it, add salt to it, and make a dough. And then do other kinds of things to those higher level ingredients, and then finally you end up with a nice pizza. So, as remotely simple as it will be to make pizza by just mixing stuff together, it will also be as simple to model complex data with just fully connected neural networks. Yes, theoretically, if you take all of those ingredients and mix them up for perpetuity, for infinitely number of times, yes, one of those possibilities could actually give you pizza, but good luck finding that possibility. It's like having a lot of letters in a bag of letters, millions of letters, and try to mix them up, mix them up, mix them down, mix them up, and expect like a Shakespeare play to come out of it. Theoretically, it's possible because that play is a combination of those letters, but the probability of that is so small. So this is kind of an analogy why we use specialized structures for neural networks. We don't just feed data into a fully connected neural network and expect it to handle that just by throwing raw power at it. Yes?
Actually, by giving all those filters are the same, should we expect the filter be the same as well?
Yeah, so in this case, yes, the values, it would have been nice if I used different values. I overlooked that. So in general, yes, the values of those filters will be different. There's no reason for them to be the same things. This will be decided during the training process. I'll talk about that more. Other questions? Okay. All right, so this idea of taking some sort of filter and passing that over data is actually not developed for neural networks. This is something mostly coming from the signal processing theory, where people deal with signals of arbitrary shape and complexity, and then they use different filters to extract different features from a signal. So this idea is not new, is not only specific to neural networks, but it has been nicely used in the context of neural networks. So basically, you can see that this operation of passing a filter over an image or over some data is called convolution. And basically, the meaning of the word is just to take something, pass or slide it over the data that you have. That's meaning of convolving. Okay. So a convolution is a specific type of multiplication. For example, in the scalar case, if you take a scalar feature and a scalar weight, there's only one way to multiply that feature by that weight, because both are scalar. However, when you take an image and you have a filter that's different in size, it's smaller, it's not immediately obvious how to do some kind of multiplication between these two, right? There are many ways to do that, right? You can pass the filter over that and then sum up the values. You can take the average values. You can do a bunch of other things. So a convolution is a specific type of doing the multiplication. Because here we're not dealing with scalar weights, scalar features, we're dealing with tensor weights, tensor features, so the multiplication operation itself is something different. Okay. All right, and this is a visualization of an example of convolution. We take a filter with the shape 3 by 3, and then we pass that over an input image or an input tensor. It doesn't need to be an image. Okay, and you can see this is the generated output. We put the filter on top of the image, multiply those elements of those matrices in an element-wise manner, and then we sum up the results. And that gives us one new pixel in the new image. Then we take the filter, we slide it over 1 pixel, or maybe 2 pixels, or as many pixels as you like, and then we do the same thing to generate another new pixel, right? We do the same thing, we pass it over we can pass it over all of the pixels or some of the pixels, and then generate a new image in the output. Okay, and you can see here that the output image, or the result of the transformation, is 1 pixel smaller in each direction. This is because when you put the filter on the top left corner of the image, you can only generate a new value for the second column, second row item, right? Because we don't have anything on the outer boundaries. So the output result, until you do something about it, will be a little bit smaller, and that depends on the size of your filter. Okay, let's show you some examples using PyTorch. Okay. Okay, so that's the image of the cat. What I do here, I use matplotlib to read the image into my Python environment. And the image has the form of a tensor. So if you import the general image into your Python environment, you end up with a three-dimensional tensor. The first two dimensions are the height and width of the image. Those are the pixels, basically. And the third the third dimension represents the channel of that image. So images are a combination of usually three channels if they're RGB, red, green, blue. And when you visualize the image, you actually see a combination of all those channels when you see different colors. That's how color images are generated. So this is why, in this case, I'm only taking one of the channels. Okay, it doesn't matter which one in this case. And then I plot only that channel. You might say, why is it not blue or green or red? This is because in this case, I'm not interested to see a red image or a green image. I just want to see the light intensities. This is why I have this argument, CMap, color map, is great. Because at this point, I'm not interested in the color. I just want to see what each pixel value, what light intensity it has. Okay, and you can see that here. This gives me a NumPy tensor, and then I convert it to a PyTorch tensor. Okay, so this is an example of a filter that blurs an image. Okay, so I can define it as a PyTorch tensor. I call it a kernel. Okay, and then I have a convenience function for you again that applies that kernel onto the image and shows you the output alongside the original image. Okay, you can see this is the original one. The other one is the blurred one. Okay, why has it been blurred? Because when we do the transformation using that kernel, you can see that we put the filter on top of the image. The middle value of that kernel has a large value, so it's giving more weight to the item in the center, to the pixel in the center, and it kind of also receives some contributions from the neighboring pixels. This is why it kind of blurs or it kind of incorporates effects from neighboring pixels into the current pixel as well. So the result will be like taking the average. So basically, this type of convolution is like taking a Gaussian kernel and pass it over some data to obtain a moving average kind of thing. Okay, I also have a video to show you here, which I think is helpful to visualize things. Ignore this part. Okay, for example, here we have an image on the left-hand side. You can see the filter at the top. And then on the right, you see the results. So this is, again, this is like passing not a Gaussian filter, but the effect is still blurring because we take contributions from the neighboring pixels. And this is how the convolution works. You can see the filter is being passed over different parts of the image, and it generates a new transformed image. Okay? And this is how the transformation works. So these are the weights inside of that kernel. It takes each pixel with a different color or different light intensity and then sums up the results. And that results in a new pixel in the generated image. This is what you can see on this screen. Okay. And so this is a new kind of multiplication operator that you can see here. As I mentioned, we're dealing with matrices. The multiplication operator is no longer a multiplication, it's a convolution. Because you have to think about how you want to do it. Convolving a filter is one way to do that. Now, this is what it's showing here. Okay. And this idea of transformation, again, is kind of very general in different fields. If you are familiar with differential equations, for example, you can transform the whole equation by doing a convolution, taking it to another space, solve it there because the equation is simpler there, and then transform back to the original space. Again, same idea. You use convolutions. Okay, another example, convolving a filter on an image. And then here, in this case, the middle element has a larger weight. And if you visualize that, it looks like a Gaussian kind of filter. Okay. And then you can see the result, again, is generated by doing the same kind of operation, just a little bit more complex. So just a different kind of filter, nothing else. And it's called a Gaussian blur. All right. So going back to our example here, this is just what I wanted to tell you how this image is blurred according to that filter. Let's see other examples. Sure, yeah.
Define kernel. Do we need to make sure the weights inside of it is sum up as close as we want?
So question is to decide what the weights should be. Should we make sure that the weights sum up to 1 or something else? The thing is, we don't decide that. This is decided by the neural network in the course of training. And I will talk that. It doesn't have to be 1. Yeah. Okay, so another filter, another generated transformation. You can see that this filter is particularly doing well in highlighting the edges of that image. Okay. And another one, something different. Maybe I don't know how to interpret that, but this is the output that we get. There's a link for a website that you can apply different types of filters to pictures that you can upload. That might be helpful. Okay. All right. So there are two things that we should be, two parameters that we can decide when we do filtering, when we do convolutions. One is padding, the other one is the concept of strides. So padding relates to the thing that I discussed earlier. I said that if we just take the filter applied on that image, the resulting image will be smaller. However, we can pad the original image on the boundaries with certain values so that the resulting image is actually the same size as the original image. That's the concept of padding. And usually padding is done with zeros. So we just pick a boundary of zeros around the pixel, around the image, and then do the convolution to generate the same, an image of the same size. The concept of stride. So a stride means a certain kind of step. So you can take the filter and then do the convolution, do the multiplications and everything, generate 1 pixel, and then when you want to move over, it's up to you to decide how many pixels you want to move over by. So you can move over 1 pixel, we can move over 5 pixels, it's up to us. Okay? So this is called, this parameter is called a stride, and basically shows the step in which we move our filter over the image. We can control both of these in PyTorch, and I'll show you how. So this is padding, and you can see that here I have padded the image with zeros. And what is the stride in this example? 2. Yes, the stride is 2. So in this case, you can see that although we padded the image, but because we're taking strides of 2, the resulting image is still smaller. So these two kind of work together to decide what the size of the output image will be. And this is important for when you want to set the parameters of your neural network model. I'll show you that later. Yes?
Is it a good practice to have a larger stride when we have a larger kernel?
A larger stride when you have a larger kernel. It really depends on your data. It really depends on the density of information that you expect in each region of the image, a bunch of other things. Sometimes you can't really justify your choice, but some strides work better than the others. You just have to be careful to, if your image is too dense, probably your stride should be 1 pixel. If your image is not that dense, then you can effectively compress your image better down to lower dimensions by taking larger stride. Yeah, kind of rule of thumb. Yeah. Oh, because if we want to generate the same output image size for whatever reason, you don't always need it, but sometimes it's helpful to have it so that it's easier to work with the parameters in our network, and it doesn't really affect anything. So in that case, All right, we're back. So, in the old days when people tried to do image recognition using more manual methods, so researchers had to come up with their own filters. So, for example, they had to find out what is the filter that gives you better edges, what is the filter that gives you better detection of certain color regions or stuff like that. And that was a completely manual process. So we had to decide what the weights should be. The beauty of a convolutional neural network is that the weights of the filters or the filters themselves are going to be learned. So the neural network is going to search for what are the best filters that if you apply that to your data set, it will generate the most useful features for predicting a class. So the filters are going to be learned. There is no human is involved in designing those filters. Previously, we had to design filters. Right now, we learn the filters. Okay, so for a convolutional neural network, we need a number of ingredients. The first thing, as you might have guessed, is a convolutional layer. And the operation that I described to you has been already implemented in PyTorch. So there is a specialized type of layer in PyTorch called conv2D. You also have conv1D or conv3D, but for the case of an image, we use conv2D. And it has 5 parameters. The first 2 parameters are about the inputs and output channels. So if you have an image that has 3 color channels, then if you feed it to a convolutional layer, then the input channel number will be 3. However, if you take only one channel of that image, that's only one feature, the number of channels will be 1. The output channels is something that we decide. So how many filters do you want to be applied to that image? How many new transformed images you want to have in the output of a convolutional layer? That's something that we decide. That is the output channels. That's what this parameter decides. Again, the kernel size, something we decide. So it's the size of that filter that we apply onto the image. We have seen examples of 3 by 3. It can go smaller, larger. If your filter size is too large, then we kind of approach the same problem that we had before. If you take it to be the size of the image, then it's going to be the same as what we had previously. So you multiply each pixel by a weight, and then it becomes a fully connected neural network again. Yeah.
Do we pick higher out channels in terms of more complicated?
Yes. So when your data set is more complex, yes, the preference is to take more and more filters, but there's obviously a limit to that. Beyond a certain point, yeah, it doesn't help you that much. So stride and padding, we have discussed them already. So let's take a convolutional layer, torch.nn conv2d, number of input channels, number of output channels, and a certain kernel size. And if we don't specify the stride and the padding, let's see. So the stride is 1, the padding is 0 by default. Okay, so let's apply that onto our image. You can see this is the output that we get. Okay, and let's run that again. Okay, again. So each time, it's a little bit different. Why? Right, and because I've told you that when you create a model or any layer of the model, the weights, the biases are going to be randomly initialized. So in this case, it just uses random filters of that size. This is why it's changing. Okay, so a different type of filter. This time we have one input channel. However, we have 2 output channels, meaning that we take this image, but we generate 2 transformed images, and each one has its own weights and biases. You can see that they change. Okay, 1 input image, 3 transformed images. Okay, you can see we can decide that. And we also have used a different kernel size. It's slightly larger. Okay, now we're taking a very large kernel size. And you can see the output image is much smaller. The size on the screen is the same, but you can see it's pixelated because you have to convolve that over the image, but the boundaries are very large, so you only take the center part of that image. Okay. But if we add padding, with the same kernel size, we end up with the same size of the image. You can see 80 something, 100. They are of the same size because we have added a large padding here, so that takes care of the boundaries. However, by taking a very large kernel, you can see that there's a lot of information that have been gone missing because the filter is too large. Okay, so if you want to have a padding that gives you the same output size, you can use this formula. So padding, divide the kernel size by 2 and round the result. That will give you an image of the same size. If you have a filter of size 5, you need a padding of 2 on each side to end up with the same image size. And we can also play with the strides. This is an image of striding the image, so the kernel size is large itself, but we are also moving over by 3 pixels when we convolve our filter on the image. Okay. And now, let me show you a few diagrams that helps with the number of parameters that we have and the structure of the network. So here, one input channel. We take that with convolutions. We can generate 5 output channels or any number of channels that we like. Here, we take a color image, and then we have 3 input channels. So we can take each channel and generate as many output features from that as we like. Okay, so you apply one convolution layer. It takes care of how many input channels you have, how many output channels you want for each input channel, and it generates those features for you. So again, I want to make this analogy with the case of a fully connected neural network. You can think of each transformed image in this case as the counterpart of it in a fully connected neural network is one neuron. It's one scalar input feature. So in a fully connected neural network, if you take one example of the data set, each feature is a scalar value. Here, each feature can be thought of a matrix value. The weights are also matrix values. So it's kind of the same thing, except for the fact that instead of scalar values, we have matrix values or tensor values. Okay, so if this was a fully connected neural network, we would have 3 input features, right? And then for each of these input features, we would have 3 neurons that take in those input features, and they generate this many output features. Okay. All right. Now let's take a look at this example here. So we have a conv2D layer. The number of input channels is 1. Output channels is 3. The kernel size is 3. And this is the number of parameters that we have. So here we have, because we have 3 output channels, it means that we have 3 kernels. And each kernel has 9 elements. Okay. So that's 27 parameters for that. And for each tensor neuron, we also have a bias. Okay. So 3 biases total. 27 plus 3 would be 30 parameters in total. Okay, so in the case of FCNN, fully connected neural network, we would have 3 weights, 3 biases. That would be it. In this case, we have a kernel, which is matrix, and so on. Yeah. Okay. All right. So another example. Okay, this time we have 3 input channels or 3 input features, image features, and we have 3 output image features. So in this case, each of these links represents a kernel of size 9. Okay, so there's 9 there. We have 3 input channels, 3 output channels, so you multiply all together, there'll be 81 parameters, and for each one of those, you add 1 bias parameter, meaning that we will have 3 biases in total for that layer, and that gives us 84 parameters. So next thing that's important in terms of coding is the dimensions that PyTorch expects for your images and for your kernels. So the images in PyTorch, they are 4-dimensional tensors. The first dimension, let's talk about the last dimensions first. So we have the image height and the image width. Instead of having the number of channels in the end like a regular image, the number of channels is the second dimension. Okay, so these 3, when you read an image, you have those 3 as well. That's not specific to a convolutional neural network. However, the first one, you don't have that with a regular image. That's the batch size, because we take images in batches, not just one. So the first dimension is the batch size. If you have 5 images per batch, that dimension will have a size of 5, and then along other dimensions, you store the images themselves. For what? Sorry, can you repeat? Oh yes. So yeah. So the thing is, when you have a color image as the input feature, then yes, the number of channels that enters the neural network should be 3. That number of channels. But beyond that, we decide how many channels is being outputted from each layer. Yeah. Okay, for the kernels, it's pretty much the same thing. So here we have number of channels, kernel height, kernel width. However, in the first dimension, we have the number of kernels that's being used in this current neural network layer. And why is it this way? This is because it's been figured out by developers. This is the most efficient way of dealing with the matrix multiplications and linear algebra in the most efficient way. So we don't really care about the reason why it's this way. So the 3 parameters are kind of self-explanatory. We have a batch size for the image. For the kernels, pretty much the same thing. Why exactly is it this way? Can't we shuffle the dimensions? Maybe we can, maybe we can't, but this is the preferred way for efficiency reasons. Okay. So let's take a look at the image of the cat in terms of a tensor. So you can see when I read that image in, I have 100 pixels, 100 rows, 100 columns, and I have 4 channels. The reason it's 4 channels, that's because with PNG images, we have an additional channel that gives us the transparency or opacity of that image. This is why PNG images can have transparent backgrounds. So usually with JPEG or with other types of images, we don't have that channel. But with PNG images, the last one is the opacity channel. Okay. So now we can, because it's a tensor, we can only pick up one of the channels. And in this case, we end up with a 2-dimensional matrix that's essentially just the pixels of that image. Okay. Now here I'm defining a convolution layer. 1 input channel, 1 output channel, meaning that I want 1 image goes in, 1 transformed image comes out. That's my layer. However, if I run this code right now, it doesn't work because it says the image is not in the shape that I expect it to be. So we can either have a 3D input or a 4D. So the default is 4D, but if you don't have a batch size and you're only inputting 1 image, you can also use a 3D tensor. So here I have my original image. It represents the original elements, and I'm introducing 2 new axes for my image, 2 new dimensions, so as to make it 4-dimensional. And when I do that, we end up with this. It's the same thing, it just had more added dimensions. Now, if I apply that convolution layer on top of that, it works, and we end up with 9696 because we don't have any padding. Okay, and the kernel size was 5, so we lose 2 pixels on each boundary. We can also feed unbatched images. So I told you that the first dimension is the batch size. In this case, it's 1. But it's also possible to feed images with only 3 dimensions. So I can here make the image 3-dimensional and then feed that to the convolutional network. I think it used to be not work. But in this new version of PyTorch, I noticed that 3D tensors also work. This is not something that we work with usually, because in the neural network, everything is 4-dimensional, but just to show you that it doesn't give any error. Yes, sure. Good question. Yes. So the question is can the kernel size be different, like be asymmetric, like 5 by 4 or something like that? Absolutely, yeah. There's nothing preventing us from having kernel size that are not symmetric. The thing is, when you use an asymmetric kernel size, then the outputs will be biased towards certain directions. So this is not something that we want. And expanding on that idea, this is also why we don't use kernels with even size. Because with even size, you cannot symmetrically put a filter on the image or on a pixel. And in that case, we have something called aliasing effect. Again, giving some bias to some certain directions, depending on how you do your convolution. Okay, so in the lab, you manipulate the filters in a convolutional layer, and then you visualize the outputs. So I just wanted to tell you that matplotlib doesn't understand PyTorch tensors. So first of all, we have to convert everything to NumPy. Second thing is that PyTorch also doesn't understand 4-dimensional, 3-dimensional images. It only understands 2-dimensional images. So this is why when we have an image coming out of a convolution layer, we apply this squeeze function from PyTorch. What it does is that it removes dimensions with size 1. For example, here I have a size 1 dimension over here. When I apply squeeze, it just squeezes that image to only the important dimensions. Okay, so this is something else that I have to do. And last thing that I need to do is to make sure that we detach that image, that output of the convolutional layer from the computational graph of PyTorch. So this is important in order not to track the gradients, and I think otherwise it will also will not work with conversion to NumPy because it is something that's inside of a computational graph. The conversion itself is going to be taken as an operation. PyTorch tries to track those operations. It doesn't work. So you have to detach that tensor, squeeze it, and then pass it to plt.imshow, which, let's see. Oh, I squeezed the image already. Yeah, so I have to remove that. Got input of size 100 by 100. Let me redefine the image actually. Maybe that's helps with that. Because we're doing some operations in between, maybe it messes with it. Okay. So we do that, and then we do squeeze again. Okay. Yeah. It's the image itself, I guess, that's not working. Yeah, it's the image itself. Okay. Yeah. I have to do this actually. Okay. Yeah, it's because I wasn't careful with the order of running the cells. So here we go. Bottom line is that what comes out of a convolution layer, you can't just take it and plot it. You have to take care of the dimensions, the extra dimensions. You have to detach it from the computational graph, and then you can plot it. All right. Questions? Yes. So if
the image, it represents the, let's say, color or like features of that image.
Right.
In the kernel, it represents the output or like number of filters.
Yeah, because the number of filters also decides how many output images you have. It could be both. It could be how many images you want to come out of this convolution layer, or how many filters, because they're the same thing. If you have 3 filters, you will have 3 output images. Okay, so now that we have these convolutional layers, we can stack as many convolution layers as we want in our neural network, just like regular hidden layers. Okay, so in this case, we we have two such layers. And then finally, what we need to do in order to make our classification is that we have to compress everything down to one or a few output values in the end in order to do classification, basically. In binary classification, you need one or two outputs. In multi-class, you need as many outputs as there are classes. So basically, we have generated some nice transformations on those images that we're going to learn the optimized values for. Okay, that's all right. But eventually, we have to compress everything down to the size of the output. So how are we going to do that? Okay, we can use a fully connected layer right at the end. So once we are done with our convolutions, we can have a fully connected layer in the end to take care of compressing the information down to how many outputs that we like. For example, here I have a conv2D, and then I pass the outputs through ReLU. We have activation functions. Without activations, everything is linear. Okay, again, we have a conv2D, another ReLU. Note that the number of output channels coming out of a layer should be equal to the number of input channels to the other layers. So 3 and 3, these should be the same. Okay? And then finally, the result that comes out of this layer is two channels, meaning two transformed images. And what we need to do with that, in order to feed it into a regular, fully connected network, is that we have to flatten the entire output. So we take the two images, we put them on top of each other, okay, and then we flatten the entire thing. Okay, so if you have two images, 100 by 100, 100 by 100, you have 10,000 plus 10,000, so 20,000 pixels. This is why we have 20,000 in here. And notice that in this linear layer, it takes in 20,000 inputs, scalar inputs, compresses it down to one value. Okay, and this is the shape of the output of each layer. Note that because I have used padding, the output size of each layer is the same as the size of the input image. Yes?
Quick question. On the flattened layer, is there a way to have it automatically take the number of outputs from the previous layer to set that?
Sure. Because you can come up with a formula based on how many channels you have in between, and then use that formula to automate that. That's actually a very great idea, because otherwise, when you play with the number of convolutions and stuff like that, you always have to do those computations and do this model.summary, for example, to see exactly how many parameters you want to have in that layer. That's a very good idea, actually. Yeah. Okay, so this model summary, remember that we have to pass an input size to it in order for it to print out the size of the intermediate results. Otherwise, it only gives you the number of parameters. Okay. So at the end, we have 20,001 here and 20,087 parameters total. That's kind of a lot. Okay. Yeah. So we have another ingredient. Next ingredient is called pooling. So pooling is about taking the most important features of each part of an image. So the idea is that when you do the convolutions and you end up with a output feature, the thing is, not all of those converted pixels are actually important to make a nice prediction. So for example, one way to summarize that information is that, okay, we have done our convolution, here's our transformed image. Now we can do another operation. We can apply another filter on top of each group of pixels and maybe take the average or take the maximum of those pixels. So kind of summarizing that information in there. One of the most common things people do is doing max pooling, meaning that you apply a filter, and then what that filter does is that it takes the maximum value of that pixel. So if you have 4 pixels, you only pick one, the maximum one, or you take the average. So you kind of summarizing the information. This is a very reliable technique for reducing dimensionality of the problem. So, for example, here is an example of max pooling. So this red area that you can see, it has been placed on the image, and we take the larger value, For example, on the top left-hand side, the largest value is 7 for that group of 4. And here the largest one is 9. And here the largest one is 8. Here is 4. So we take that image, do max pooling, end up with a smaller image with the most salient features, with the most important features. Okay. And as you might have guessed, we have another module that takes care of that for us. So the size of the max pooling layer decides how many pixels do you want to take in as a group and then apply the maximum on. So we can use 2 by 2 in this example. That's up to us. It has different effects whether we take 4, we take 9. So these are open questions. But essentially what it does, it reduces dimensionality. And this time, once we do max pooling after each convolutional layer, we end up with only 1,250 features in the end. This is down by a factor of nearly 20,000. So that's a big gain in terms of dimensionality reduction. Okay, so only about 1,000 remaining features. And that's much more, that can be handled much more easily. Okay, so these are basically the ingredients we need to design not to say a simple, but the basic version of a convolutional neural network. Okay, so layers of convolution, and then finally flattening things, passing things through a fully connected layer. That fully connected part can have multiple layers. Usually you need more than one layer in order to add some nonlinearity to that as well. So here we just have one, but in other cases, for example, in the lab, you might need more than one. All right. So here's an example of a well-established architecture for convolutional neural networks. This is the kind of diagram that you'll see all the time when looking at CNN recipes. For example, here we have image of 224 of size, and then here is the convolution layer in between, and the thickness of that block is equal to the number of output channels that you'll have. So you can see that the image is progressively compressed down, but becomes larger in terms of number of features. And then finally, we pass it through 2 dense layers, and then finally to the classification layer. This is called AlexNet, which was developed by this guy, Alex Krzyzewski, and he was a PhD student, Jeffrey Hinton, which is the mastermind behind artificial intelligence neural networks since a very long time. This architecture won one of the most important competitions that was run in 2012, I guess, for image recognition, and it got an accuracy that was, I guess, either was better than human accuracy for image detection or on par with human level. So before this architecture, accuracies were not that good. But using this architecture, for the first time, they reached human level accuracy for image detection. Okay, so once again, typical ingredients that we have for convolutional nets. We have the convolution layers, activation functions again. There are other ingredients that pooling is not that much optional. I should actually make that non-optional, because otherwise your network will be too large. However, we will also learn about a technique called Bayesian normalization. I kind of give you a hint why Bayesian normalization can help with training a neural network when we talked about activation functions and the saturation ranges, positive, negative. And then dropout, we have learned that dropout turns neurons off randomly, and that helps with overfitting problem. Yes? How do they come up with this architecture? Yeah. So when I or anybody else shows the end result of something, it seems like someone got up in the morning and said, hey, it would be nice if you have some blocks of coordinates and then a dense layer. Usually this is not how it works. People have been trying hard on tying in the idea of convolutions, and they got some successes. Then at some point it wasn't too good, that they invented max pooling, and then it wasn't again so good. Then they said, okay, why not using it as a feature engineer, pass things to a densely connected one, and then densely connected networks didn't work that well because they didn't have good optimization algorithms. And yeah, it's a lot of bouncing back and forth between different efforts, different ideas until they got up with this. But you can, if you really want, how do people come up with these ideas? The best idea is to read some review articles. For example, every few years there comes a review article by one of these prominent people that kind of summarizes the journey from the basic ideas all the way to the most complex ones. Those are the best ideas. That's the best idea to see kind of the development journey. Okay, so sometimes ideas come from different fields. The idea of convolution comes from signal processing or control theory, for example. But sometimes these are just purely empirical. People stumble upon stuff when they try to experience with things, especially in case of neural networks, because they're usually too complex to work out their details and their intricacies theoretically. All right. So just to give you a comparison between CNNs and FCNNs, FCNN, fully connected neural network. I'm defining a fully connected neural network like we had in the previous lecture. So only linear layers followed by activation functions. And in this case, I have convolution layers. And then if we compare the size of the number of the parameters for the fully connected with a simple problem of image recognition that we tried, we get almost 4 million parameters, which is too much. However, with the convolutional neural network, with the techniques that we learned, we can reduce it down to 49,000 parameters. And 49,000, if you have a sizable data set, that's perfectly practical. Okay. So I guess the main theme of this lecture, the main idea that I wanted to convey is the thing that if we already know something about the data set that we're working with, if we can make some assumptions, the best idea is to incorporate those assumptions in the model that you're trying to develop. And those assumptions give bias to your model. It's not about the bias term in linear regression, it's about the general biasing of a model, making it preferring certain solutions more compared to other solutions. For example, if you know that the trend of your data is linear, then you want to use a linear regression model because you don't want to fit your model too well, fit the noise, because you know the underlying theory dictates that this model should be linear, although you get some fluctuations. So with a neural network, if you fit the same model and you don't make that linear assumption, you're going to fit all the noise eventually, and that's not good. So this is why incorporating structural bias into neural network models is kind of the most successful idea. What makes these neural networks so good in adapting to certain data for which we can make certain assumptions. In a CNN, the assumption was that those pixels in each other's neighborhood, they have some relations to each other. They're not separate from each other. They mean something when they're viewed together. Okay? And we have similar architectures for different kinds of problems. For example, in the next block, you learn about certain architectures for learning time-dependent data, LSTMs, long short-term memory, and stuff like that, and also certain architectures for neural networks for example, text generation or text processing. Okay, so for each one of those, we have certain types of architectures that works best because we incorporate ideas from domain knowledge. Okay, one other thing that I think is very interesting is that this idea of convolutions is not only specific to images. We can actually generalize this idea to general graphs. If you remember, you had a question on the quiz in 512 that told you that this is an image. We can represent the pixels as a graph where the nodes, the pixels are connected to their neighborhood. And it wasn't a complete graph because each node was only in connection with its neighbors. Not all of the data in the world are images. Sometimes we have graphs representing other types of information. For example, you have, I don't know, protein data, molecular structures that there are connections, they're not images. However, there's still some ideas about the fact that each molecule is related to the other molecule in its neighborhood, not to the others. And this contains some information for successful modeling of that data. So you can take this idea of convolution on images and you can generalize that to convolution on graphs. And that's a huge topic of research these days, very hot topic, and it's a beautiful idea. It's a little bit complex in the beginning to understand how it works, but basically if you understand image convolutions, generalizations shouldn't be too hard to understand eventually. Okay, so all right, I had a bunch of true and false questions. I forgot to remove the answers. So let's just discuss them. Yeah, so first one, input to a PyTorch conv2D is a 2D tensor. People might think this is true because we feed images, but no, PyTorch expects tensors of a certain shape for its training process, the batch size, number of channels, and this and that. Same goes for the output. The output of a conv2D, again, is a 4-dimensional tensor because it's an output transformation of that image, and it still has to work with other layers, so it has to have number of batches, number of channels. And so the parameters of a conv2D form a 4D layer. When we say parameters, we basically mean the kernels. Technically, the parameters also contain the biases, but disregard that for now. So here we mean the weights. So the weights form a 4-dimensional tensor. That's correct, and we have learned what the shape is. One other statement here is that adding more fully connected layers after flattening always increases the number of parameters. And that's true because, so you have a bunch of features and you have a fully connected layer. Of course, if you increase the number of hidden layers there, you'll increase the number of parameters you have in the model. However, I could have given you a hard time in the quiz saying that the CNN with more convolutional layers has more parameters, but that's not true. Because it really depends on the type of that convolution, the filter you're applying, the strides, the max pooling that you do. A neural network that has more convolutional layers does not necessarily have more parameters. Okay. Any last questions? Yes?
Do we get to decide what kind of kernel we want to use?
In terms of the size or?
Like the distribution, for example. We apply a Gaussian type of kernel.
Oh, so again, I want to stress this point that we do not decide what elements goes into the kernel. That's decided by the optimization algorithm. It's basically the neural network through the optimization algorithm finds the best filters that if you apply to the data, it results in the best predictions. So it automatically learns those values. Yeah. But we can have our own filters. We can freeze the weights and, for example, add an edge detector ourselves. That's also possible, definitely. Yeah. Other questions? All right. And that's it. Thank you, everyone, and have a nice rest of your week.